Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio channel. Tonight we enter a world most people never see clearly, a world that begins when the sun finally gives up and the fields turn dark. What happens when the work bell stops? But danger does not. How do you rest when the walls are thin? The floor is hard, the air is crowded, and the night itself seems to listen. In 1840, across plantations and farms of the American South, Black Americans living in slavery faced evenings shaped by hunger, watchfulness, family duty, aching bodies, and tiny acts of care that made survival possible. You can almost see it now, the last orange line of daylight fading behind cabins, the smell of smoke caught in damp clothes, the soft murmur of voices that know how little belongs to them except this hour. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and you walk with the tired crowd toward the slave quarter as evening lowers itself over the plantation like a heavy blanket. The first thing you notice is the pace. Nobody strolls home in a romantic moonlit daze. Your legs are too sore for that. You move with the shuffle of someone who has been standing, bending, lifting, hoeing, hauling, or carrying since dawn. The earth still holds a little heat from the day, and your feet feel every ridge in the path. Dust clings to your ankles. Sweat has dried into a thin crust on your neck. The sky is deep blue now, with the first stars appearing overhead, and for a brief moment the world looks almost gentle. Almost. That is the annoying trick of twilight. It can make a place of coercion seem picturesque if you do not listen closely. So you listen. You hear pots shifting, a baby crying from somewhere ahead, a cough that sounds old and chest-deep, a low laugh, quickly swallowed, wooden doors scrape, someone calls a child inside. From farther off come the animal sounds of plantation life settling down, a mule stamping, chickens fussing, dogs restless in the yard. The big house stands apart, larger, brighter, carrying itself with the confidence of a building that expects service. The quarter, by contrast, seems gathered together for protection, a cluster of rough cabins built for use rather than comfort. In 1840, many enslaved people in the American South lived in small one-room cabins, often made from logs, planks, clay, or a mix of whatever materials were available. Some had stick-and-mud chimneys, some had dirt floors, some had board floors with gaps that let in air, dust, and every curious insect with a personal mission. Historians still argue over how much conditions varied from one plantation to another, because travellers, enslavers, and formerly enslaved people remembered these places very differently. That uncertainty matters. It reminds you that no single cabin can stand for all, even when certain hardships appeared again and again. You reach the doorway and stoop a little as you enter. Inside, the air feels close at once. Smoke lingers near the ceiling, though there may only be a weak fire or a few glowing coals. The room carries the smell of ash, damp wood, old cloth, skin, and cornmeal. There's also a faint sourness from shoes, from stored food, from life lived without spare space. It is not one smell, really. It is a whole biography of a household pressed into the air. The light is low and uneven. Firelight does strange things to faces. It softens some lines and deepens others. It makes eyes seem brighter. It turns every motion into a quiet little performance. A hand lifting a pot, a shoulder leaning against the wall, a child rubbing sleep from one eye. You're in close quarters with people who know one another's rhythms better than most married couples in modern apartment buildings. There is very little mystery in a room like this. Somebody always hears you sigh. The cabin is simple, but not empty. A few stools or rough chairs may sit near the hearth. A box, a shelf, or a peg line holds precious objects. Maybe a gourd dipper hangs where it can dry. Perhaps an iron pot rests near the fire, blackened with use. Bedding might be made from straw ticks, old blankets, worn quilts, or piles of cloth. In some places, several people share one bed platform. In others, children sleep on pallets spread over the floor. Privacy is rare. Personal space is almost a fantasy. The luxury item of the evening is not silence. It is a corner, You feel the touch of the room on your skin. The cabin holds daytime heat in some seasons, then loses it too quickly in others. On a warm night, the walls seem to trap breath and smoke. On a cold night, every crack becomes a traitor. Rough wood brushes your sleeve. Dirt or worn boards press beneath your soles. Splinters are not dramatic, but they are persistent. That was true of many things here. Yet the quarter is not only a site of deprivation, it is also a place shaped by the people forced to live in it. Within tight limits, enslaved black families made choices, arrangements, habits, and meanings. A cloth hung a certain way can mark a sleeping place. A pot set aside can preserve tomorrow's meal. A quiet phrase can warn, comfort, instruct, or tease. Survival is not a single grand act. It is 100 small decisions made while tired. You see one now in the way supper is handled. The meal is plain, very plain. Cornmeal appears often, whether as mush, bread, or cakes, and rations on many plantations also included pork, molasses, sweet potatoes, or other staples in varying amounts. Gardens, fishing, trapping, or gathering could sometimes stretch these supplies, though opportunities differed widely and permission was never something to count on. A quirky detail from plantation records and recollections is that some households seasoned poor fare with astonishing skill, turning scraps and greens into something fragrant enough to make children hover nearby before the food was ready. Human beings are stubbornly inventive, even when empire would prefer them dull. You watch someone stir a pot with the patience of practice. Nothing is wasted carelessly. Every handful matters. A child edges closer to the hearth and is guided back before little fingers stray too near the heat. Another person tears bread. Someone else waits, not from politeness alone, but because food distribution in a crowded room is its own delicate politics. The smell rising from the pot is humble but comforting. Warm meal, a little smoke, perhaps salt meat if there is any. Your stomach responds instantly. The body does not care much for abstraction. Hunger is practical. Outside, darkness thickens. The sounds change with it. Daytime noises flatten and spread out, while nighttime ones come nearer. Crickets begin their steady work. Frogs call from wetter ground. A dog barks, then another answers. Wind brushes the trees with a dry whisper. Somewhere a door closes hard enough to send a warning. In enslaved quarters, the night could offer a narrow space for family life, conversation, worship, courtship, craft, and rest. But it never erased surveillance entirely. Patrols, overseers, drivers, or unexpected visitors might intrude. Even when no one arrived, the possibility remained like a second door left open in the mind. So people learn to read sound with precision. A familiar footstep means one thing, an urgent knock means another. Loudness itself can be dangerous. Voice is often lower after full dark, not because no one has anything to say, but because too much depends on saying it wisely. You hear the difference between public talk and cabin talk. Public talk is flatter, safer, dull on purpose. Cabin talk has edges and warmth. It can hold jokes sharp enough to puncture pride. It can carry grief without display. It can pass news from neighbouring cabins and nearby plantations, births, sales, punishments, sickness, rumours of movement, whispered hopes that travel farther than anyone would admit. A woman near the fire begins speaking in a steady, unhurried tone while her hands keep working. Maybe she mends. Maybe she cleans a pot. Maybe she braids a child's hair. The story she tells might be practical. Who needs water? Who has a fever? Who saw someone limping in from the field? Or it might slip into older forms. Animal tales, trickster wit, fragments of memory carried through families and communities shaped by both African inheritance and American slavery. The room listens without looking as if it is listening. That is a skill too. Children drowse and resist drowsing at the same time. One leans against an older body and traces circles in the dust with a toe. Another starts a question, loses it, and drifts into silence. Their day has been long in its own way. Enslaved children could be drawn into labour very young through chores, watching infants, carrying water, gathering wood, or other tasks that blurred the line between childhood and work until the line nearly vanished. And still, children remained children. They fidgeted. They stared into the fire. They fought sleep like tiny attorneys arguing a hopeless case. In the weak glow, faces become landscapes of fatigue. Shoulders sag, hands open and close slowly, stiff from the day. An elder rubs one knee, then the other. Somebody stretches a back and winces. The body keeps a ledger. Cuts, bruises, insect bites, strained muscles, smoke-irritated eyes. All of it settles in at night and asks to be noticed. Sometimes the quarter held knowledge for these hurts, roots, poultices, teas, salves. Habits of care passed through experience. Some remedies helped, some merely comforted. In a world that offered little formal care, comfort was no small thing. You become aware of the fire again. Its warmth reaches your shins, but not the rest of you. The flames are modest. Fuel is precious. Even the crackle seems restrained. Sparks flare and vanish. Ash shifts inward. The hearth is not just a place for cooking. It is the room's centre of gravity. Its dim sun, its public square, its pharmacy, its clock. A person seated there can warm hands, dry cloth, hush a child, talk softly, and think. That is a lot to ask of a few coals. Then there is the sleeping arrangement. Always a negotiation with cold, heat, space, and kinship. Bedding is brought out or shaken loose. Quilts, if a household has them, carry their own history in each piece of fabric. Blankets smell of smoke and many nights of use. Straw rustles under weight. A child is lifted half asleep. Another is nudged into a certain place. Adults angle themselves to fit where they can. Touch is unavoidable. You feel the press of shared existence. An elbow, a knee, a shoulder, the rough edge of cloth, the warmth that one body gives another without ceremony. It is intimate, but not necessarily peaceful. Crowding can comfort and irritate in the same breath. The cabin grows quieter by degrees, not silence, never that. More like layers being lowered one by one. Conversation softens as fire settles. Someone hums a few notes under their breath. A baby finally yields to sleep. Crickets continue outside with impressive dedication. Now and then a horse snorts from far off. The whole plantation seems suspended between exhaustion and vigilance. And here, in this dim room, you understand something essential. Night in the slave quarter is not simply the absence of labour, it is a separate labour. You must cook, mend, soothe, share, listen, protect, prepare, and somehow rest enough to rise again. You must do this while carrying the knowledge that your time, your movement, your home, and even your family ties can be interrupted by power beyond your control. Yet the room is not empty of dignity. It holds order made by the people inside it. It holds tenderness, wit, memory, skill, and a quiet refusal to become only what the system intended. Sleep does not arrive like mercy from a storybook. It comes carefully in pieces as the fire dims and the cabin breathes. Eyes close, then open once more. Someone turns over. Someone whispers a final word into the dark. Smoke lingers above. Night air slips through cracks. The body eases down onto rough bedding and accepts what comfort it can find. This is how the evening begins in 1840, not with peace exactly, but with endurance made ordinary, which may be the more remarkable thing. By full night, the cabin stops looking like a building and starts behaving like a living creature. It creaks, exhales, sweats, shivers, and complains in its own dry wooden language. You feel it around you at once. The walls hold a little warmth, then give it up. The roof mutters when wind passes over. The packed seams between logs or boards seem solid in daylight, but now every crack has personality. One lets in cold air near your ankle. Another leaks a thread of moonlight onto the floor. Another carries the outdoor smell of damp leaves and distant mud. You sit inside this small world and understand that shelter, in 1840, is a fragile achievement. Many slave cabins in the American South were built quickly and cheaply, with materials chosen less for comfort than for availability. Logs might be notched and stacked, then chinked with clay, mud, moss, sticks, or scraps to block the gaps. On some plantations, the walls were planked instead. Roofs could be made of split boards, shingles, or whatever could be managed. Chimneys, when they existed, were often built from sticks plastered with mud rather than brick. That combination gave the quarter its familiar smell: smoke, earth, damp wood, an old fire braided together so tightly you could almost taste it. And you do taste it. Smoke sits on your tongue. It threads into your hair and your clothes. It lives in blankets, on sleeping mats, in every fold of fabric and every rough beam overhead. Fire is necessary, but it is not tidy. A cabin fire warms, cooks, dries, and protects, while also filling eyes with sting and lungs with a slow irritation. People in these quarters did not need a modern lecture on indoor air quality. Their bodies had already gotten the memo. The light comes from the hearth and perhaps from a tallow candle if one can be spared. That means the cabin is partly visible and partly guessed at. Corners blur, shadows gather in the joints of the room. You can see the nearest faces, the nearest objects, the nearest hands at work, but anything beyond the centre feels softened, as if the building prefers secrets after dark. You notice how carefully the room has been organised. Nothing here is random because there is no room for random. A stool sits where it can be moved fast. Cooking tools stay near the fire. A bucket, if there is one, must not be kicked over. Bedding is stored or stacked until needed. Clothes dry where smoke and heat can reach them without burning them. One corner might belong mostly to children. Another may be where an elder settles. A box beneath a bench might hold the household's precious little reserve. Maybe a spoon, a needle, a comb, a scrap of cloth worth saving, perhaps even a Bible or a page from one. This arrangement matters because the cabin is rarely just a place to sleep. It is workshop, nursery, kitchen, infirmary, and refuge. The same patch of floor serves many purposes in the space of a few hours. A child is washed there. A garment is repaired there. Supper is served there. Someone groans with pain there. Then bedding is spread and the room becomes a sleeping chamber for several bodies at once. Modern houses like to pretend one room should do one thing. This room laughs at that idea. The floor under you tells its own story. If it is dirt, it has been swept, tamped, and learned by feet. Dirt floors were common in poorer cabins, and they absorbed spilled water, ash, crumbs, and years of movement. They felt cool under bare soles in hot weather, then bit with cold in winter. If there are floorboards, they may be uneven and loose, polished only by use. Through gaps you might glimpse darkness below, or feel a wandering draught. Either way, the surface is hard, real, and utterly unimpressed by anyone's aching joints. You run your fingers along a wall and feel the texture of labour. Clay daubing cracks as seasons shift. Wood dries and roughens. Smoke darkens everything. Sometimes newspapers or scraps of cloth were used to patch openings or line spaces, though such materials were not always available. In recollections from the 19th century, formerly enslaved people often described cabins that had to be repaired again and again because weather, insects, and poor construction never stopped testing them. Historians disagree on how much enslaved people themselves chose these repairs and how much the plantation regime directed them, since records can be sparse and heavily filtered through owners' accounts. What is clear is that someone had to keep the place from falling apart, and that someone was rarely the person who claimed ownership. The cabin's most temperamental resident is the chimney. A mud chimney behaves like a moody relative. Sometimes it draws well and carries smoke upward. Sometimes it sulks and pushes smoke back into the room until everyone squints and coughs. A little shift in wind, a little dampness in the fuel, and the whole evening changes. Sparks may shoot where nobody wants them. Loose mud can crumble. There is always some degree of negotiation between fire and architecture, and neither side is especially reasonable. That is why people learn the house by instinct. You know where the warm patch of floor is. You know where dripping rain lands during a storm. You know which board complains loudly when stepped on. You know where mice prefer to run. You know where to hang clothes so they dry but do not catch. You know exactly how far a child can crawl toward the hearth before you must grab the back of a shirt. These details may seem small to an outsider, To the people living here, they are the map of safety. There are unwelcome visitors too. Insects love a warm cabin. Fleas, lice, mosquitoes, and bedbugs were common nuisances across poor housing in the 19th century, and slave quarters were hardly spared. Mice could get into food if it was not protected. Rats might appear in some places. Spiders took up their own little kingdoms along rafters and in corners. One odd detail from plantation recollections is how matter-of-fact people could be about such company, as though sharing a room with creatures that bite, scurry, and steal was just another tax of poverty. You slap at a mosquito, shake out bedding, and continue with life because what else are you going to do? Write a polite complaint to the vermin. The roof overhead deserves its own paragraph of sympathy. When weather is fair, it merely hovers there, suspicious and uneven. During rain, it reveals character. A good roof drums, a bad one tattles. Water finds seams, slides down beams, and lands exactly where you hoped it would not. Pots, bowls, and spare cloth are shifted quickly. Bedding is rescued from the damp. People squeeze away from the leak and closer to one another. Even on dry nights, the memory of leaks changes how a room is used. The best spots are never just comfortable. They are contested. You feel that contest in where people place themselves now. Near the fire means warmth, but also smoke and the risk of sparks. Near the wall may mean a little more room, but also more draught. Near the door offers airflow in summer, yet brings colder air in winter, and makes you first to hear any approach from outside. The most desirable sleeping place is not grand. It is simply the least troublesome. Children are taught these preferences without formal lessons. They learn by being moved. Not there, too near the hearth. Not here, that crack lets wind through. Not by the door, you will wake freezing. The instructions are practical, repeated, and swift. A household under pressure cannot afford long philosophy. Even affection is often delivered in the tone of logistics. You also notice the importance of elevation, however slight. A box, a bedstead, a stacked pallet. Even a folded cloth can mean the difference between some comfort and none. Beds in many quarters were rudimentary if they existed at all. Some were wooden frames filled with rope, slats, or cords supporting a mattress of straw. Corn shucks, moss, feathers, or whatever could be found. Others slept on pallets placed directly on the floor. Bedding had to be aired, shaken, patched, and guarded from dampness when possible. The smell of straw mixed with smoke is one of the quiet signatures of such a room. When someone sits to mend torn cloth, you see another hidden part of cabin life. Housing conditions shaped clothing, and clothing shaped survival inside the cabin. Garments were often coarse and issued sparingly by enslavers, then altered, preserved, and reused until fabric itself seemed exhausted. A shirt becomes a smaller shirt. A dress becomes patches. A patch later becomes a tie, a rag, a wrapper, a quilt piece. Needles were precious. Thread was precious. Hands were not allowed to be precious, yet they were the greatest resource in the room. Every stitch is a little argument against waste. The smell changes as night deepens. At first the dominant note is cooking smoke. Later it becomes warmer, softer, more human. Heated cloth. Cleaned skin if washing has been possible. Damp wool or rough cotton drying by the hearth. Clay walls cooling. Ash settling into itself. There is also the faint mineral scent of stored water. You can tell the room has entered its second shift, the part of the evening when eating gives way to tending. Someone checks the doorway, a wooden latch, a bar, or simply a habit of listening stands between the household and the outside dark. Cabins were not fortresses, but doors still mattered. A closed door marks a boundary. It says this space, however controlled, contains a family or a group with its own rules, its own whispers, its own griefs. In a society built on denying enslaved people legal power over home and kin, the act of closing a door carried more meaning than the carpentry alone suggests. Then there are the sounds the walls cannot keep out. Dogs, wind, nearby voices, footsteps on packed ground. Somewhere a horse shifts. Somewhere a baby in another cabin begins crying and then stops. The quarter is a cluster of lives close enough that no one is fully alone. That closeness can comfort and irritate, A loud neighbour remains loud in any century, but it also means help may be near if illness comes, if a birth begins, if a child worsens, if trouble approaches. Thin walls do not only betray privacy, they can carry warning. You begin to see the cabin as a compromise between what was imposed and what was made livable. The structure itself may be poor, but the practices inside it are skilled. Sweeping reduces pests. Storing tools in the same place saves frantic searching. Drying wood near the hearth makes tomorrow's fire easier to catch. Stuffing cracks with cloth or clay cuts a little draught. Hanging garments wisely keeps them from mildew. Saving grease, salt, or scraps changes tomorrow's meal. Nothing here is luxurious. Everything is deliberate. The cabin also shapes posture and movement. You bend more, reach carefully, step around sleeping children, turn sideways near the fire, sit low, rise slowly, touch walls for balance in dim light. Bodies in small spaces become experts in not colliding, at least not more than necessary. There is a subtle choreography to shared shelter. A stranger would blunder. An inhabitant glides, and still. No amount of skill erases the truth that these cabins were built within a system designed to extract labour, not nourish life. Comfort was not the priority of the plantation regime. Function was. A cabin had to keep workers available, not content. Yet within that harsh equation, Black Americans in slavery made domestic worlds as best they could. Worlds of order, warmth, rhythm, and care inside structures that often deserved none of those beautiful words. The fire burns lower, clay walls catch the fading glow and hold it for a moment like embers in disguise. Smoke thins, then gathers again in one stubborn corner. A hand smooths bedding. Another hand lifts a child closer. The room settles into itself, not elegant, not quiet, not easy, but inhabited with intelligence. You feel the cabin around you. Rough and underbuilt. Yes, yet also taught into usefulness by repeated human effort. It is not merely shelter. It is survival arranged within 4 imperfect walls. Night has fully taken hold now, and the cabin begins to revolve around food. Not around feasting, of course. Nobody here is tossing grapes into the air and asking for imported cheese. This is supper at the hard edge of necessity, where every crumb has work to do. Yet that only makes the scene more revealing. You learn a great deal about survival by watching what people eat when choice is scarce and waste is dangerous. The hearth glows low and steady. Its heat brushes your face while the rest of the room stays cool. A pot shifts on the iron hook or rests near the coals. Steam rises in soft curls, carrying a smell that is simple and blunt. Cornmeal, greens, maybe pork if any has been saved, maybe a sweetness from molasses or roasted sweet potato. The smell is not luxurious, but it draws every tired body closer. Hunger has a way of making the ordinary smell almost holy. In 1840, many enslaved people received weekly or monthly rations, though the exact amounts varied from place to place. Cornmeal was one of the most common staples. Salt pork or bacon often appeared too, sometimes in meagre portions. Molasses, peas, rice, flour, or sweet potatoes might supplement those rations on certain plantations. Enslaved people frequently grew food in small garden plots when allowed, or stretched meals through hunting, trapping, fishing, gathering wild plants, or keeping chickens. Historians continue to debate just how much autonomy those gardens and side resources offered, because conditions differed sharply, and because enslavers often exaggerated their own generosity. The records love a flattering story. Inside the cabin, flattering stories are not much use. What matters is whether the pot feeds everyone. You watch the cook, perhaps a woman, perhaps an older child, perhaps whoever had enough energy left to take charge of the meal. The motions are quick but not rushed. Water is added carefully. Meal is stirred so it will not clump. A handful of chopped greens disappears into the pot. Bits of onion, if there are any, release a soft sweetness into the smoky air. Fat is treasured. Salt is treasured. Even the spoon scraping the sides of the vessel seems to say, not one bit left behind. That scraping sound is followed by smaller kitchen music. A lid set down, a wooden bowl moved along the table or bench, a knife tapping a board, hands brushing flour from cloth, a child swallowing impatiently. Outside, insects drone in the dark, but indoors the tiny sounds of supper take over the world. This is the meal after labour, which means it must do more than satisfy appetite. It has to repair the body enough for another day. That is an almost impossible assignment for thin rations, yet people work at it with skill and memory. One of the quiet marvels of enslaved domestic life is how much culinary intelligence survived under such pressure. A little smoke can deepen flavour. Greens can become richer with a scrap of fat. Cornmeal can take several forms and therefore feel less monotonous. Mush one night, hoe cake another, ash cake on a different evening, fried if grease is available, plain if it is not. When ingredients are few, technique becomes personality. You lean closer and catch a nuttier smell from bread baking near the fire. Bread in these cabins is rarely the fluffy cloud modern diners expect from a bakery. This is practical bread, dense, filling, built like it expects a hard life. Cornbread, ash cake, or pone can be made from simple ingredients and cooked close to coals or in a skillet. It breaks with a crumbly edge. It sticks a little to your fingers. It tastes of grain, smoke, and the labour required to produce both. Children hover in the way children always have around food. One stares openly at the pot, another pretends not to care while inching closer. A younger child may already be nodding with sleep, then revives instantly when a bowl appears. Hunger wakes people. The body, again, is extremely practical. Serving the meal is its own ritual. Adults often make sure the smallest children eat first, or at least eat with some protection from the faster hands around them. An elder may be offered a place by the warmth. Someone with an injury might receive a little extra if the household can manage it. These choices reveal moral priorities inside a system that recognized very few of them. When you have almost nothing, distribution becomes a language of love and authority at once. The bowls are plain, the spoons may be shared, some eat from wooden vessels, gourds, or whatever container the household has. Food disappears quickly, but not without attention. You hear the soft scrape of spoon against bowl. Breathing slows as mouths fill. There is a pause that is nearly sacred. A few moments when talking drops away because eating requires full concentration. The room that carried work chatter and domestic instructions becomes briefly focused on the act of taking in strength. The taste is humble but layered by need. Cornmeal feels thick and familiar on the tongue. Greens bring bitterness and earth. Pork, if present, sends salt and richness through the whole bowl like a rumour of abundance. Sweet potato has a gentle softness, almost comforting enough to make you forget the day for half a minute. Molasses, even in a small amount, can brighten the meal with a dark sweetness that lingers at the back of the mouth. Nothing here is fancy. Everything here matters. One quirky detail from recollections of plantation foodways is how often people remembered specific flavours decades later. Not grand banquets, but the taste of roasted corn, persimmon beer, wild berries, a rabbit stew, poke greens, or a fish caught in stolen twilight hours. Memory clings to flavour because flavour is one of the few luxuries poverty cannot entirely erase. You may be denied comfort, privacy, mobility, education, and rest. Yet one spoonful of well-seasoned greens can still tell you that skill survives. Of course, skill cannot always defeat shortage. There are nights when food is thinner than it should be. Nights when the pork ration has run low, when the garden has not yielded enough, when sickness or weather has disrupted everything. On such evenings, the cook stretches the meal by adding more water, more meal, more patience. Stretching food is one of the oldest domestic arts on earth, and the enslaved households of the American South practiced it with grim expertise. A small pot becomes many bowls if you know how to manage expectations, timing, and silence. Silence is useful at supper for another reason. It hides calculation. You can almost see people judging portions with a glance, deciding whether to take one more bite or leave it for someone else. A mother may claim she's not very hungry. An older sibling may pretend to be full. An elder may eat slowly to make a modest share feel larger. Nobody gives a speech about sacrifice. They simply practice it, quietly, repeatedly. A fire pops once, and a child jumps. Then comes laughter. Warm and brief. That laugh matters too. Supper is not only fuel, it is one of the few times a household gathers in relative closeness without the immediate demands of field labour. People can exchange looks, jokes, complaints, tiny bits of gossip, sly impressions of someone pompous, all while holding bowls that warm their palms. Human beings are not machines refuelling in a shed. They are social creatures, even when exhausted. You hear someone tell a teasing story about a person who burned a cake or salted a pot too heavily. The room reacts with quiet amusement. Nobody here has the energy for theatrical comedy. But a dry joke can travel far on little fuel. Gentle sarcasm, in fact, may be one of the cabin's most renewable resources. It costs nothing and often lands beautifully. Even under oppression, somebody is always ready to make fun of a fool. After the first hunger is eased, attention shifts to tomorrow. Leftovers, if any exist, are covered or set aside. Cold ash may preserve a cooked potato. A crust might be saved for a child's breakfast. Grease is not discarded carelessly. Bones may be boiled again. Nothing retires after one performance if it can still contribute. The modern habit of throwing out a questionable half-onion would seem almost mythic here, like the behaviour of a civilization too spoiled to fear January. You also notice who is absent from the table, or rather from this particular table of floor, stool, and hearthside sharing. On many plantations, family members could be housed apart, hired out, sold away, or assigned to labour that kept them from a common evening meal. The meal therefore contains not only presence but absence. A place in the room can feel occupied by memory even when physically empty. Scholars still dispute how often separated kin could visit one another at night, because practice is varied, and plantation records are maddeningly selective. The uncertainty hangs like smoke. What survives clearly is the ache, so supper can also be an act of remembering. Recipes, techniques, and food preferences carried fragments of African American, and regional traditions: okra, rice, black-eyed peas, yams, greens, peanuts, benny seeds, and many other ingredients and methods formed part of a culinary world shaped by forced migration and local adaptation. Not every household had access to these foods at all times, but the broader food culture of enslaved communities profoundly influenced Southern cooking. The irony is almost irritating. A society that degraded black life happily absorbed black skill at the dinner table. When bowls empty, people do not simply collapse at once, so there is still work in the aftermath. Utensils must be rinsed if water allows. The pot must be scraped. Ash may need tending. A crust on iron becomes harder to clean if left too long. Someone folds cloths. Someone checks the food storage. A child is sent to fetch one more thing and returns half asleep. The room smells different now. Less of active cooking and more of lingering warmth. Cornmeal, smoke, grease, damp clay, and human breath settle together into the familiar scent of night indoors. Your own body responds to the meal even in imagination. Shoulders drop a little. The sharp edge of hunger dulls. Warm food spreads through chest and belly with the deep calm that comes after deprivation. Not plenty. Just enough to continue. It is not bliss. It is relief. Perhaps relief is the more serious pleasure. The bowls sit stacked or turned over. Coals glow red under a layer of ash. Children lean against adults. Someone licks the last bit of molasses from a thumb. Someone else wipes a spoon clean with bread because wasting flavour would be a small crime. There is tenderness in these efficient gestures. The meal has been made, shared, and survived. And that is the larger truth here. Supper in the slave quarter is not a decorative domestic scene. It is strategy made edible. It is nutrition, hierarchy, memory, humour, and endurance boiled in one pot. Each ingredient carries labour. Each bite answers scarcity with ingenuity. Each shared bowl says that even within a system built to reduce human beings to labouring bodies, those bodies still gather, taste, choose, nurture, and preserve one another as best they can. The food may be plain. The intelligence behind it never is. Once the bowls are cleared and the sharpest hunger has eased, the cabin changes again. Supper has filled the room with steam, motion, and scraping spoons. Now those sounds recede, and another kind of life takes over. This is the hour of low voices. The fire has sunk to a patient red glow. Shadows soften across the walls. Outside, the quarter is dark except for a few scattered points of light. A crack under a door, a weak flame behind papered gaps, a brief lantern moving and then gone. Inside, words begin to matter more than objects. You notice right away that nobody speaks at full volume. There is a particular softness to these voices, not timid exactly, but measured. Each sentence seems to know the walls are thin. The cabin holds speech the way a cupped hand holds water, carefully, never trusting the edges. A whisper is not always a sign of fear. Sometimes it is intimacy, sometimes it is habit, sometimes it is simply courtesy to sleeping children. Yet under slavery, quiet talk also carries the discipline of danger. Too much heard by the wrong person could bend tomorrow in ugly ways. So the room practices a kind of verbal craftsmanship. People speak in layers. One sentence means exactly what it says. Another carries a warning beneath the plain surface. A joke about weather may also be a joke about someone's mood. A remark about shoes may really be about whether a person travelled farther than they should have. A pause after a name can do half the work of a full explanation. In such a place, conversation develops muscles that formal speech never needs. The fire makes a small sound, a tick, a soft settling sigh. That little sound gives cover to a sentence, then another. Soon the cabin is threaded with talk. You hear practical matters first. Who is feverish? Who is limping? Who needs thread? Who has a child with a cough that will not leave? Who heard the overseer in a sour mood? Which woman in the neighbouring cabin may be near childbirth? Whether rain is likely? Whether someone can spare a little meal? Domestic information moves with impressive speed because it must. A community under pressure cannot wait for an official newsletter. It makes its own. Then gossip arrives, because of course it does. Human beings remain gloriously consistent across centuries. Someone laughs quietly about a boastful man whose hat seems to hold more pride than good sense. Another passes long news of a couple exchanging looks near the water source, with all the subtlety of children stealing apples. A woman imitates a pompous accent so perfectly that shoulders begin to shake with restrained laughter. The joke never rises above a murmur, but the pleasure is clear. Humour is oxygen in rooms where the air is otherwise rationed. You hear names from nearby cabins, from the fields, from the kitchen house, or from the stable yard. The plantation is large enough that nobody knows everything, yet close enough that everyone knows something. Information arrives incomplete, bent by memory and emotion, but still useful. A man was punished. A woman received news of a child elsewhere. Someone may be sold. Someone may be hired out. Someone has angered somebody foolishly important. Each report changes the atmosphere of the room by a degree. Talk is not idle here. It is navigation. Some stories are offered plainly. Others come wrapped in indirection. A person might say, "Best not be late tomorrow," and mean much more than timekeeping. Another might remark, "Dogs were restless," and several listeners understand that patrol movement may be increasing. Enslaved people often had to cultivate careful speech under surveillance. And historians have long noted the role of double meanings, coded expressions, and context in black oral culture under slavery. Scholars still disagree about how widely certain phrases or codes were shared across regions, because evidence is fragmentary, and much of this knowledge lived in performance rather than writing. That uncertainty feels appropriate somehow. Not every valuable thing leaves a neat paper trail. The children who are still awake listen even when adults assume they are not. That is one of childhood's finest talents. A child sprawled near the hearth seems half asleep, but the ear remains open. Another picks at a thread on a blanket while absorbing names, tones, worries, and patterns of adult life. This is education without a slate. Through evening talk, children learn who is trusted, who is vain, who is kind, who is quick to anger, what dangers have no visible shape, and how a community reads itself. No one announces, "Tonight's lesson is social intelligence." The lesson happens anyway. Now and then the talk shifts from news to memory. An elder may speak of a person long gone, perhaps sold, perhaps dead, perhaps simply carried into the blur of distance that slavery created so well. Memory in such a room is fragile but persistent. It comes in fragments. A way someone laughed, a phrase often said, a talent for fixing pots, a habit of singing while working, a scar above one eye. The details are ordinary, which is exactly why they matter. Oppression tries to flatten people into function. Memory restores their particular shape. You can feel listeners adjust when certain subjects arise. Bodies still, hands stop moving for a moment, eyes lower. There are losses in the room that everybody knows not to touch carelessly. Yet silence around loss is not simple either. Sometimes silence protects grief. Sometimes it protects rage. Sometimes it is only fatigue. You cannot turn pain into speech every night, and still get enough sleep to stand at dawn. Then comes another kind of speech, softer still, prayer. It may be formal or barely formed. Some households gather openly around a spoken prayer. Others let one person murmur over a child or over the room itself. Christianity had spread widely among enslaved African Americans by 1840, though its meanings varied. Many found strength in biblical stories of deliverance, judgment, and divine presence. At the same time, older spiritual understandings, folk practices, and community ways of making meaning continue to shape religious life. There was no single neat line between one inheritance and another. Faith in the quarter could be layered, practical, hopeful, fearful, and fiercely personal all at once. You hear phrases asking for protection through the night, for the sick, for scattered kin, for enough strength to meet morning. The tone is not ornamental. Nobody is performing piety for applause. This is prayer stripped to need. A quirky detail from some recollections of slave life is how ordinary objects could become part of a person's quiet belief. A Bible page tucked away, a root carried in cloth, a whispered verse, a habit of turning shoes a certain way, a warning against speaking of certain things after dark. Outsiders love to label such practices superstition, usually while believing all sorts of nonsense themselves in better tailoring. Inside the cabin, however, these acts often functioned as reassurance, continuity, or small forms of control in a world built from uncertainty. The conversation does not stay solemn for long. It moves like firelight, bright here, dim there, never fixed. Someone brings up a story from work, a mule that refused to command with admirable moral clarity, a child who asked an alarmingly direct question, a woman who managed to save a cake from burning by a miracle bordering on witchcraft. The room warms with restrained amusement. Laughter is careful, but real. It comes through noses and shoulders, through briefly covered mouths, through eyes closing in relief. Loud laughter would carry too far. So it is folded inward, a private kind of joy. One voice begins telling a tale. Maybe it is a trickster story. Maybe it is an animal tale that lets everyone enjoy the downfall of arrogance without naming any current authority too directly. Brer Rabbit and other cunning figures would become famous later in print, but the broader tradition of clever underdogs and talking creatures was already rich in black oral storytelling. Such tales entertained, instructed, and disguised commentary. A fool in a story is never only a fool. A fox is rarely just a fox. A small creature winning through wit can nourish a room better than one might think. You notice how storytelling changes the cabin's breathing. Even the fidgeting children quiet down. The voice at the centre does not need grand drama. A raised eyebrow, a pause, a lowered tone, a sudden little imitation of a voice. These are enough. The listeners supply the rest. They know the rules. They know when to murmur agreement, when to shake their heads, when to smile at a line coming around like an old friend with new shoes. And through all of this, the dark outside remains present. A knock can still interrupt. A step outside can still freeze the room. Voices never forget that possibility entirely. That tension shapes the rhythm of talk. It creates a shared alertness under the softness. One ear listens inward, to the speaker. The other listens outward, to the yard. This double attention is exhausting, but it becomes almost instinctive. There is another purpose to evening talk that is easy to miss. It helps people hold on to selfhood. By day, many hours are commanded, monitored, broken into tasks, and judged by others. At night, in these low conversations, enslaved people reclaim interpretation. They say what happened and what it meant. They decide who acted foolishly, who acted bravely, who was wronged, who was vain, who was generous. That may sound simple. It is not. The power to name reality is a serious power. Around the hearth, even quietly, people exercise it. A woman near the wall braids hair while she listens. Fingers move steadily through another person's hair, parting, smoothing, crossing, tightening. The sound is soft, almost like cloth. Grooming and conversation belong naturally together. Hair care in enslaved communities could carry practical, social and cultural meaning, even under harsh limits on time and resources. A child leaning into such hands receives more than a hairstyle. The touch itself says you are seen. The fire is lower now. Coals pulse under ash. The room smells faintly of cooling clay and warm cloth. Some of the youngest have gone fully to sleep where they sat. All resistance spent. Adults continue talking over them, not carelessly, but with the ease of people used to making life happen around sleep. You begin to understand that the whispering hour is not a lesser version of public life. It is its own world, a hidden civic space inside the quarter. News is exchanged, reputation is built, grief is managed, humour is sharpened, belief is spoken, children learn, community feels itself alive through sound. Soon voices will thin. Someone will decide enough has been said. Another will offer a final word, half comment, half blessing. The room will drift towards stillness. But for this span of night, the cabin glows not only with fire but with speech. Quiet speech, measured speech, clever speech, weary speech, loving speech. You sit among it and feel how much of survival depends not only on food or walls or bedding, but on the chance to speak in your own register among people who understand the weight beneath your words. As the cabin grows quieter, your attention shifts to the people who need the most tending. In any hard place, the very young and the very old reveal the truth of a household. Strong adults can hide strain for a while. Children and elders cannot. Their needs rise to the surface like candlelight in a dark room, small but impossible to ignore. A child stirs near the hearth and lets out the sort of tired whimper that is not quite crying. Someone reaches over at once without speaking and settles a hand on the child's back. That simple touch says everything. You are here, you are not alone. Go back to sleep in the slave quarter. Much of care happens this way, quietly, automatically, folded into other work. There is no spare time for tenderness, so tenderness learns to travel inside routine. Children in 1840 lived deep inside the labour system of slavery, even when they were too small for field work. Very young children were watched by older siblings, grandparents, or adults whose own chores could be done nearby. By ages that would seem shockingly young to modern eyes, many were already carrying water, gathering wood, minding infants, chasing birds from crops, or performing other tasks around the plantation. Historians still debate the exact age when childhood gave way to labour across different regions and holdings, because plantation records were inconsistent and owners often disguised exploitation as light work. The children themselves, of course, were not fooled. Tonight you see what that means indoors. The littlest ones are heavy with sleep, their limbs loose and warm, heads falling against shoulders, mouths open with total lack of dignity. It is impossible not to feel affection for them. One child's foot sticks out from under a blanket, dusty and impossibly small. Another clutches a bit of cloth like a personal treaty with the universe. They look peaceful now, but the day has already asked too much of them. An older girl guides a toddler away from the coals with the stern patience of someone who has done this 50 times. She cannot be very old herself, yet there she is, already carrying authority in her voice. Enslaved children often matured early because the structure around them required usefulness. Older siblings became assistant parents almost by necessity. They fed, hushed, washed, watched, and corrected the younger ones while still being children themselves. It is a strange theft, adulthood arriving not as freedom but as unpaid duty. Still, they learn real skill. You watch an older boy tuck a blanket edge under a smaller child so it will not slip off in the night. He does it with competent hands. Another child knows exactly how to rock a baby just enough. Not too much, not too fast. A girl can tell by touch whether a forehead runs warm. Nobody gives medals for this. The cabin notices and carries on. Survival has no award ceremony. The elders sit or lie in places chosen for reason, closer to warmth if joints are stiff, near the wall if they need support, away from the door if the night air bites. An older woman rubs her hands together, then holds them toward the coals. The backs of her fingers shine orange in the dim light. Her face shows that long kind of tiredness that belongs to years, not just a single day. Around her, younger adults make subtle adjustments, shifting a stool, passing cloth, offering the least troublesome spot without making a spectacle of it. Respect here is practical. It brings the better blanket, not a speech. In enslaved communities, elders often held vital knowledge, practical, social, medicinal, spiritual, and genealogical. They remembered names, kin ties, births, sales, deaths, weather patterns, food tricks, herb uses, and the unspoken rules of surviving a plantation regime. Some had memories reaching back toward earlier generations shaped by slavery's first violence on this soil. Others carried fragments of African cultural memory in stories, songs, or habits whose origins had blurred but not vanished. An elder in the quarter was not simply a retired labourer. Often that person was an archive with sore knees. You hear it in the way people consult them. A younger woman asks in a low tone what to do for a child's cough. An older man comments on the weather and how it sits in the chest this time of year. Someone mentions a dream. Someone else asks whether a tea should be stronger or weaker. The reply may be brief, even dry. Elders often have no patience left for decorative phrasing, yet the room listens. Experience has authority that even slavery cannot erase completely. Not all old age in the quarter is serene. Of course, it can carry pain, irritability, grief, and fear. A body worn down by decades of forced labour does not settle into gentleness by magic. Backs ache, eyes dim, teeth fail, hearing weakens, old injuries argue with the weather. A person who spent years in fields or at punishing domestic work may have hands thickened, joints enlarged, gait shortened, breath shortened too. Night brings those complaints forward. Day can distract, night keeps score. One elder coughs, a deep, rasping cough that seems to come from somewhere under the ribs. Everyone hears it. No one panics, because this is familiar, but the room subtly rearranges around the sound. A cup is passed. A cloth appears. Someone asks a soft question and receives a nod. Care, again, takes the shape of small efficiency. The youngest and oldest share one thing very clearly. They cannot simply be left to the system's roughness without consequence. So the household creates a protective circle where it can... That circle is not perfect. Children still suffer, elders still suffer, but the intention is real. It shows in who gets the closer place, the warmer cloth, the first answer, the second glance. In a world where the law refused to recognize black family bonds as fully binding, nightly acts of tending made those bonds visible anyway. You do not need paperwork to know whose child this is when 3 adults rise at the same cry. There are sleepy rituals too. A child's face is wiped with the corner of an apron or a damp cloth. Hair is patted down. Hands are checked for burrs, soot, splinters, or crusted dirt. A blanket is shaken. A lullaby might be hummed so softly it almost dissolves into breath. The melody may not be complete. Nobody here is staging a concert. It is enough that the tune steadies the child's breathing. A quirky detail from 19th century recollections is how often children invented games or amusements from nearly nothing. Corn cobs, string, pebbles, carved scraps, stories, rhythms tapped on wood. Even after exhausting days, some of that playful energy survives into the evening until sleep finally overtakes it. One child here traces shapes in the dirt with a fingertip. Another whispers nonsense to a sibling and gets a muffled giggle in return. Childhood, stubborn as grass through stone, keeps appearing. Then the adults hush them again, not unkindly. Night demands caution. Too much noise can carry. Too much movement keeps everyone from settling. And some grown people are simply beyond their last nerve. Fatigue makes saints testy. A tired adult in a crowded cabin has the same basic wish as any tired adult in history. Please, dear heavens, let somebody stop wriggling. The watchfulness in the room increases as the younger ones finally fade into sleep. Children asleep are softer, but also more vulnerable. Blankets must stay over them. Babies must not roll too near the fire. A child with fever must be checked again later. An elder with pain may need help rising in the dark. No one says, "Now begins the night shift." Yet that is exactly what this is. You notice who stays half awake. Usually at least one adult remains alert longer than the rest, mending, tending the coals, listening for outdoor sounds, or simply because their body cannot drop into sleep at once. Sometimes an elder does this by habit, sometimes a mother, sometimes whoever knows that another person in the room is unwell. The cabin may look at rest, but part of it continues watching. This watchfulness extends beyond the walls. The quarter at night is full of uncertainties, patrols, drunken visitors, an overseer with bad temper, dogs set loose, weather turning suddenly cruel, illness worsening, childbirth beginning. All these possibilities live just outside the cabin's imperfect security. Adults with children and elders inside do not need to name every danger. Their bodies have memorized them already. An older woman lifts a child and settles the little head more firmly against folded cloth. The movement is slow and practiced. You can almost feel the weight of that sleeping child. Warm, awkward, complete. Then the woman eases herself back, not without a wince. Care often hurts the caregiver. That is one of history's less glamorous truths. There is also the matter of stories told specifically for children and elders. Stories adjusted to those listeners. Not the sharp gossip from earlier, and not the deepest fears either. Something gentler. Perhaps a tale with an animal hero, or a memory dressed into safer shape, or a half-sung rhyme repeated until eyelids sink. Elders may contribute too, sometimes with humour so dry it lands a second later. A child asks a question that seems innocent, but opens a whole philosophy. Adults answer half away, because some truths are too large for bedtime and others are too dangerous for children to speak aloud. You begin to feel how the cabin operates like a net, not a soft, decorative one, but a working net, knotted by many hands, always under strain, always requiring repair. Children and elders are held within it as best the household can manage. One person alone could not do this. The labour is collective. Someone cooks while another soothes. Someone mends while another listens. Someone advises while another lifts. Community is not a slogan here. It is a sequence of tired people refusing to let the most vulnerable fall through, and yet there is beauty in the refusal. A sleeping child's breath evens out. An elder's shoulders lower once the pain eases a little. The fire gives off a modest warmth. The whole room, though worn and poor, becomes gentler around those who need gentleness most. Nothing about slavery encouraged such care. It had to come from the people themselves. That may be what stays with you most in this hour of the night. Not innocence exactly, because there is very little innocence left in a system like this. Not peace either, because peace is too grand a word for a room this crowded and worried. What you witness instead is deliberate tenderness, practical, unsentimental, deeply skilled. The youngest and the oldest are guarded through the dark by hands that have already done too much today, and still find a little more to give. As the night grows colder, every piece of cloth in the cabin gains importance. During the day, clothing marks labour, dust, sweat, and weather. At night, it becomes something else entirely. It turns into insulation, privacy, status, memory, and sometimes the thin difference between decent sleep and miserable endurance. In a room where heat is limited and bodies are many, fabric starts to feel almost alive. You notice it first in the way people handle their garments. Nobody tosses clothing aside carelessly. A shirt may be loosened, dried, folded, turned, or hung near the hearth with careful judgment. A dress might be brushed free of loose dirt before it is used again in the morning. A scarf or kerchief is untied and smoothed. Worn shoes are placed where they will be found quickly. A child's jacket, if there is one, gets draped over smaller shoulders already drifting towards sleep. Even rags have value here, especially rags. A rag can pad a shoe, plug a crack, wrap a sore hand, strain liquid, protect a pot handle, or line bedding. Poverty trains the eye to see secondary uses everywhere. In 1840, enslaved people often received limited clothing allowances from enslavers, though the quality and quantity varied widely. Common issued garments included coarse shirts, trousers, dresses, shoes, jackets, hats, and blankets, usually made from rough fabrics such as osnaburg, woolens, or cheap blends. Children might wear very little in warm weather, especially when young. On many plantations, these allowances were inadequate for the seasons and wore out long before replacements came. Historians still debate how representative certain plantation records are, because owners tended to describe provision in ways that made themselves sound humane. Paper can be very generous on behalf of the powerful. The cloth in front of you tells a sterner story. A shirt has elbows patched in fabric that does not quite match. Another garment has been turned inside out once in its life and perhaps wishes not to discuss it. A dress hem has been resewn by a hand more practical than neat. Some pieces are stiff with repeated washing and hard conditions. Others hold the shine of wear at knees, cuffs, and collars. Coarse cloth rubs the skin in unforgiving ways. After a full day of labour, those rub points matter. A seam that scratches by noon can feel like a personal enemy by midnight. The air tonight has a dry bite. You can feel it at the ankles first, then creeping upward. The fire helps, but only within its reach. One side of your body warms while the other stays cool. That unevenness defines the room. The people nearest the hearth guard their spots without appearing to do so. Nobody announces territorial rules. The angles of knees and blankets say enough. Blankets emerge now with almost ceremonial importance. They may be thin, coarse, patched, smoky, and carrying years of use, but they are precious. A blanket can become a shawl, a screen, a mattress topping, a baby wrap, or a fold over the feet. Some households had quilts pieced from saved scraps. Others made do with woven coverlets, old wool, or layered clothing spread over sleepers. Bedding in slave cabins was often insufficient, and in winter the problem sharpened terribly. Accounts from the era describe people sharing beds, mattresses, or makeshift pallets simply because body heat was one of the few resources that multiplied through closeness, and so the room arranges itself by warmth. Children are placed in the middle, where heat gathers. An older person may lie closer to another body for comfort, whether or not either person particularly enjoys that degree of intimacy. Couples, siblings, parents, grandparents, and children settle in combinations shaped less by preference than by need. The touch of another human being through rough cloth can be startlingly reassuring on a cold night. A shoulder against your back, a child's warm foot against your shin, a blanket edge tucked under your arm. These things do not solve poverty, but they blunt it. The texture of everything becomes vivid in the cold. Wool feels scratchier. Linen feels colder at first touch. Worn cotton softens where it has been handled most. Straw in a mattress rustles under weight. Corn shucks inside a tick shift and crackle. A smooth patch sewn over a hole feels different from the surrounding cloth. Cooler or stiffer or oddly thin, your skin notices all of it. Cold makes the body attentive. Near the fire, someone stretches a pair of damp shoes or stockings toward the heat, though not too close. Wet things dry slowly in a crowded cabin. The smell rising from them is earthy, almost sour, mixed with smoke. Drying garments by the hearth is risky, but going to bed in damp cloth is worse. Every household knows this little equation. You choose the danger you can manage. One quirky detail from old recollections is how creatively people adapted cloth beyond the original garment. Flour sacks, old shirt tails, feed bags, torn petticoats, even bits of curtain or cast-off household fabric could become patches or quilt pieces. Nothing was beneath rescue if it could still block wind or cover skin. The resulting appearance may not have pleased a fashionable eye, but fashion has never had to survive January in a leaking cabin, with one good blanket among 5 people. You also notice the ritual of undressing that is not really undressing. Very few people are stripping down for luxurious rest. They remove only what can safely be removed. Outer garments may stay on. Shoes come off if dry enough. A kerchief is loosened. A jacket may become a folded pillow. Children might be slid out of the dirtiest outer layer and tucked into cloth that is slightly cleaner or warmer. Adults often sleep partly dressed because morning comes early, because the room is cold, and because sudden disturbance is always possible. Sleepwear, in the modern sense, belongs to a different economic universe. The issue of shoes deserves its own respectful sorrow. Shoes issued to enslaved people could be heavy, ill-fitting, crude, and slow to replace. Some went barefoot much of the time, especially children and in warm seasons. When shoes existed, they mattered terribly in cold weather. Feet crack, blister, swell, and ache after long days. And nighttime brings the unpleasant intimacy of removing worn shoes in a smoky room. You can almost smell leather, dampness, old dirt, and tired skin. Somebody rubs a foot absent-mindedly before settling down. That gesture contains an entire essay on labour. Bedding is spread now in full. A pallet on the floor may begin with straw, dried grass, pine needles, corn shucks, or scraps stuffed into a tick. Over that goes a blanket, a quilt, or a folded garment. Another covering is pulled over the sleeper. Beds, where they exist, are not necessarily much softer. Rope sags, slats creak, ticks flatten with the use, yet a slightly raised bed keeps a body off the cold floor, and that alone can feel luxurious. Children object to bedtime in every century, though here the protest is usually weaker and shorter. Fatigue wins fast. One small voice complains of cold, another wants a different place. A blanket war begins in miniature, and is ended by one adult look. Order returns. Somebody tucks cloth around a child's ears. Someone else laughs very quietly when a youngster kicks free of the blanket, only to demand it back moments later. The human race has remarkable consistency in its bedtime habits. Elders feel the cold differently. It settles in their joints and lingers there. Knees stiffen, fingers ache. A back that survived decades of labour does not forgive a draught. You see an older man position himself carefully, one blanket folded under the shoulders, another across the legs. An older woman warms her hands before rubbing them along her forearms. Small preparations precede lying down. People know exactly where cold bites them first. The body writes its own weather map over the years. Then there is winter itself, the season that exposes poor housing with ruthless honesty. On some plantations, people stuffed cracks with mud, rags, paper, moss, or straw to cut drafts. More fuel might be gathered if possible, though access to wood was not always freely controlled by those who needed it most. Some cabins became close and smoky to preserve heat. Others remained draughty despite every effort. Snow was less common in much of the deep south than farther north, but damp cold can be just as punishing, perhaps more so because it slips into bedding and bones alike. Scholars continue to disagree on how much winter mortality and illness in slave quarters can be traced directly to inadequate clothing and shelter versus overwork. Poor diet and infectious disease. The honest answer is probably that these hardships work together like bad companions. Cold weakens the body, hunger weakens it further, exhaustion lowers resistance. Then a cough becomes something heavier. You feel the cabin resisting that outcome however it can. The coals are banked for lasting heat. A child is shifted between adults. An extra cloth is laid across an elder's feet. Someone keeps a cap on while sleeping. Another wraps the neck. Hands disappear under armpits for warmth. Bodies curl inward, making themselves smaller against the cold. These are ancient strategies, older than the plantation system itself, and yet here they become daily acts of quiet defence. The sounds of bedding down are intimate and unmistakable. Fabric brushing fabric, straw settling, wood creaking under weight, a cough from one corner, the little thump of shoes set down, a sleepy complaint, then a long breath as a person finally lowers themselves to rest. The room smells of wool, ash, smoke, old cotton, and winter air slipping under the door. It is not an elegant fragrance, but it is honest. What strikes you most is the patience required by all this. Warmth is not achieved once and for all. A blanket slips. The fire drops. A child rolls away from heat. Someone wakes cold at midnight and gropes for the covering that drifted off. Rest becomes a repeated adjustment, not a single event, yet there is tenderness in those adjustments. A hand reaches in the dark to pull cloth back over a sleeper. A body shifts to share more warmth. An elder is given the inside place. A child is nestled deeper into the little pocket of heat between two adults. These gestures happen with half-sleeping hands, almost below language. Care continues even when consciousness fades. The cold keeps pressing and the room keeps answering. Fabric, patched and rough, becomes a kind of collective shield. Bedding, thin and humble, becomes a landscape of strategy. And you, sitting within this close arrangement of cloth and breath, understand that survival on such a night depended not on comfort, because comfort was far too rare, but on resourcefulness, closeness, and the stubborn will to make every blanket, every shirt, every scrap of cloth do more than it was ever meant to do. When the cabin finally settles into near stillness, another current moves through it, softer than talk and harder to pin down. It begins as a hum, not performance, not even a full song at first, just a low line of sound, almost tucked inside the breath, as if the body is soothing itself without waiting for permission from the mind. In a room where voices must often be measured, singing can shrink to the size of a whisper and still carry remarkable force. You hear it from the corner near the hearth. Someone is rocking slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to keep time with something inward. The tune rises and falls in a narrow range. Another voice, barely audible, follows half a beat behind, then lets go. The sound is grainy with fatigue. It does not aim for prettiness, it aims for steadiness. That may be why it feels so moving. Music threaded through the lives of enslaved black Americans in countless forms, from work songs and field hollers to ring shouts, spirituals, lullabies, dance tunes, play songs, and private humming that never entered any official record. By 1840, Christian influence had shaped many songs heard in slave quarters, especially those drawing on biblical imagery, judgment, crossing over, deliverance, and rest. At the same time, African musical traditions remained powerfully present in rhythm, call and response, improvisation, repetition, vocal timbre, and communal participation. Historians still debate how directly particular practices can be traced to specific African origins. Because slavery shattered records and transformed culture through violence and adaptation, the uncertainty should not obscure the continuity. You can hear inheritance even when names are missing. The room responds to the first hum as though it has been waiting for it. A child lying half asleep quiets completely. An older woman adjusts her breathing to the pulse. Someone near the door taps 2 fingers on a knee, then stops, mindful of noise. The cabin, which earlier held practical instructions and low conversation, now seems tuned to a different purpose. The sound does not fill the space. It rests inside it. The song grows a little, not loudly, never loudly, just enough for words to emerge in fragments. Perhaps a line about trouble, perhaps a line about mercy, perhaps a simple refrain repeated because repetition itself is comforting. Some songs likely came from camp meetings or worship gatherings. Others may have passed from family to family in forms too fluid to fix on paper. A tune shifts with each singer, each occasion, each need. Music here is not a museum object. It is a tool that breathes. You notice how the singing changes posture. Shoulders drop, a jaw unclenches. Even listeners who do not join are altered by it. A melody can smooth the rough edge left by a day of labour more effectively than a speech. That is not sentimentality. It is bodily truth. Rhythm reaches people below argument. The sound itself is beautiful in a very particular way. Not polished, not trained for a stage. There are breaks in the voice, a roughened note here, a weary softness there. One phrase may bend downward unexpectedly. Another lingers on a word as if tasting it. The fire adds its own accompaniment, a tiny crackle, a settling hiss. Outside, crickets keep their dry percussion. The whole night becomes a kind of hidden ensemble. Some songs in enslaved communities served obvious purposes, to accompany work, to pace movement, to ease grief, to teach, to pray. Others carried meanings that outsiders might miss. A line about Jordan could suggest death, deliverance, escape, baptism, or spiritual longing, depending on context. A line about home could mean heaven, family, Africa, freedom, or all of them at once. Scholars still argue over how many spirituals in the antebellum South contained intentional coded references to resistance or escape, because evidence varies and later interpretation sometimes outruns proof. Even so, the layered quality of these songs is clear. Under oppression, language and music learn to carry more than one burden. You hear one of those layered songs now. Its words are sparse. The power lies in the spaces between them. A phrase is repeated with a slight change in emphasis. The first time, it sounds like comfort. The second, like endurance. The third, like defiance so gentle it might pass unnoticed by anyone not listening properly. This is how depth survives in plain speech and plain song. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It settles into the room and waits. A baby fusses and is answered by a lullaby. This music is even softer, almost private, though others in the cabin catch pieces of it. Lullabies in slave quarters could borrow from hymns, folk tunes, remembered refrains, made-up lines, or pure sound. A soothing melody does not require formal composition. It requires care and timing. The singer sways. The child's breathing hiccups, then lengthens. The song narrows to a hum again. In that moment, the whole room seems to breathe with the singer. One charming detail from old recollections is how children often learned songs before they fully understood the words. They caught refrains, nonsense syllables, rhythmic patterns, and fragments of biblical language without grasping the whole meaning. The body learns music early. Meaning arrives later, sometimes years later, carrying a little surprise with it. You can imagine a child here mouthing a line tonight that will return in adulthood, wearing a different weight. Music also helps hold memory. A tune can preserve a place, a person, a season, a grief. Someone begins a melody and another person recognizes it instantly, not because it is famous, but because it belongs to a shared life. Perhaps it was sung by a mother no longer present. Perhaps it came from another plantation. Perhaps an elder brought it years ago and the younger ones keep it alive by habit, in communities fractured by sale, movement, and forced separation. Songs could travel where bodies could not. A melody might be the closest thing to inheritance some people were allowed to keep. The cabin does not transform into a grand chorus. That would be a false picture. Most people are too tired for sustained singing, and caution still governs the night. Instead, songs appear in pieces, a line here, a humming answer there, a low response from someone already half asleep. This broken quality gives the music its intimacy. It feels less like entertainment and more like shared weather. You begin to notice different functions within the sound. One voice leads because it is confident and warm. Another joins only on the last word of each line. A third stays silent but rocks in time. A child absorbs the pattern. An elder supplies a line from memory when the singer falters. This is participation without stagecraft. Community held together through overlapping contributions that do not need applause. Religion sits close to much of this music, but not always in the polished sense institutions prefer. Faith in the quarter often moved through feeling, rhythm, story, and utter dependence rather than formal doctrine alone. A spiritual sung in a cabin at night could be prayer, theology, memory, and emotional medicine in one. The biblical world offered enslaved people figures who suffered, waited, crossed waters, cried out, endured captivity, and hoped beyond visible reason. No wonder those stories stayed close. They spoke a language power could not entirely confiscate. Yet not every song is explicitly sacred. Some are playful, some are wistful, some a little more than rhythmic murmuring to settle nerves. One person near the wall hums a tune with a sly lift in it, perhaps from a dance gathering or courtship moment remembered with private amusement. Another answers with a teasing fragment, and for a second the room carries the faint outline of flirtation, memory, and laughter all at once. Even under severe conditions, people remain people. They still enjoy beauty. They still enjoy one another. You feel the touch of the sound as much as hear it. It vibrates in the chest. It smooths the inner pace of thought. The smoke-scented air seems warmer when a voice moves through it. The rough blanket over your legs feels less rough. That may sound impossible. It is not. Music alters the body's sense of the world. A room can stay poor and still become, for a few minutes, less harsh. At the same time, song can create privacy inside crowded space. That is one of its strangest gifts. A person singing softly may be expressing something too tender or risky to say in plain speech. The melody carries it away from the speaker's own face. Listeners understand without forcing direct confession. In this way, music gives people room even where square footage does not. There are also moments of uncertainty. A singer forgets a line. Another person supplies a different version. They pause, then continue. This fluidity reminds you that oral culture is not failure to preserve exact originals. It is preservation through living change. The song survives because it can bend. The fire drops lower still. Voices become more intermittent. A final refrain is repeated once and then again, softer each time. The last note does not so much end as fade into breathing. Someone clears their throat quietly. Someone pulls a blanket higher. Outside, the insects continue as if they have been paid by the hour. What remains after the song is almost more important than the song itself. The room feels steadier, less jagged. Whatever burdens each person carried into the cabin have not vanished, but they have been held in common for a moment through sound. That is no small achievement. Music in the slave quarter is not decoration around suffering. It is one of the ways people survived suffering without letting it define the whole shape of their inner lives. So the night continues. Smoke in the rafters, bodies settling into bedding, voices retreating. But under the near silence, the echo of that humming remains. It clings to the clay walls and rough cloth, to memory and breath, to the child now sleeping and the elder now staring into coals. A song sung beneath the breath may seem slight to an outsider. Inside this cabin, it is strong enough to carry fatigue, faith, longing, and the stubborn pulse of being fully human. As the cabin drifts deeper into night, the room begins to reveal another layer of life, quieter than laughter, and more fragile than song. You notice it in a glance first, then in the way two people pass a blanket edge without speaking, then in a pause that lasts a second longer than practical. Affection in the slave quarter rarely gets the luxury of theatrical display. It must survive in narrow spaces, under tired eyes, under watchful systems, under rules designed to make even family life feel temporary. And still it survives. That is the part worth lingering over. In 1840, enslaved black Americans formed marriages, partnerships, and family bonds across conditions that were deliberately hostile to stability. Enslavers could refuse legal recognition, arrange living quarters to suit labor needs rather than kinship, sell people away, or punish gatherings they considered inconvenient. Yet people still courted, promised, quarrelled, reconciled, raised children, and built emotional worlds within and across plantations. Historians continue to debate how best to describe these unions, whether through the language of marriage, partnership, or family practice, because the law denied legitimacy even when communities clearly recognized it. The law, in this case, was not a reliable guide to human reality. Inside the cabin, love looks practical before it looks romantic. A woman reaches to brush ash from a man's sleeve. A man shifts so a woman can sit closer to the only good patch of warmth. Someone saves the softest bit of food for another person without comment. A child climbs into a familiar lap and settles there with complete confidence. These are intimate acts, though not the sort a poet from a comfortable household would bother to notice. That is his loss, really. He would miss half of love's most convincing evidence. You see how courtship must negotiate the physical structure of the quarter. Privacy is scarce, cabins are crowded, doorways are watched by custom if not by force. Evening time is limited. A person interested in another has to work with glances, errands, church gatherings if allowed. Visits between cabins were permitted, shared labour paths, and brief moments at the edges of domestic routine. A conversation may happen while carrying water, while walking back from work, while sitting among others who are conveniently occupied with their own business. The romantic ideal of long, solitary walks under the stars would get revised very quickly here. Even so, attraction has its own stubborn confidence. It finds roots. A young man lingers near the doorway longer than he needs to. A young woman answers him with a look that is careful, but not blank. Another person in the room pretends not to notice while noticing everything. Older women, in particular, often seem to possess a supernatural awareness of who is watching whom, though perhaps it only looks supernatural because experience has made them very hard to fool. There may be teasing, but it is usually light and controlled. Too much public attention can embarrass, complicate, or even endanger. A joke passes through the room about someone suddenly caring a great deal about the path between cabins. A soft laugh follows. The person teased rolls their eyes and says nothing, which is practically a confession. Love in slavery could not rely on ordinary safeguards. A husband and wife might live apart on neighbouring plantations and visit only with permission, or by custom that could vanish overnight. A mother could fall asleep beside a child not knowing whether a sail might separate them in the future. A man might promise devotion knowing he had no legal power to protect the household he hoped to form. That instability sharpened the emotional stakes of ordinary tenderness. To hold someone close in such a world was to love them under threat. Always. You can feel that threat even in gentle moments. A couple sitting near each other must also be listening for footsteps outside. A parent smoothing a child's hair may be carrying fears too large to say aloud. Family affection is never free from the larger system pressing around it. Yet, it does not become less real for that reason. In some ways, it becomes more visible. The tenderness has edges because the danger has edges. One of the more poignant features of enslaved family life was the role of naming. Children might be named for parents, grandparents, siblings, admired figures, or lost kin. Names helped hold lineages together when official records did not care to do so accurately. Some scholars argue that naming practices in enslaved communities functioned as a quiet archive, preserving connections that sale and displacement tried to erase. Others caution that evidence is uneven and regionally varied. Both points can be true. What remains undeniable is that memory worked hard where paperwork failed. Tonight, memory sits beside affection. An elder mentions a couple from years past, perhaps with dry amusement about how foolish the man once looked trying to impress the woman who later ruled him completely. The room chuckles. Another name surfaces, followed by a silence that means the story ended badly, perhaps through sale, perhaps through death, perhaps through distance too painful to narrate. Love stories in the quarter do not all conclude softly. Many remain unfinished in the cruelest sense. Children, meanwhile, treat affection with blunt honesty. They crawl into the lap they prefer. They cling to the adult they trust most. They reach for the hand that feels safest in the dark. In that way, children announce family bonds more boldly than adults can. No law can convince a drowsy child not to know who comforts them. You watch a mother settle two children beneath one blanket, one tucked against each side, making herself into a human wall against the cold. Her face is tired beyond poetry, yet when she looks down, it softens with unmistakable devotion. Motherhood under slavery was shaped by fear, overwork, and constant vulnerability, but also by intense attachment and ingenuity. Women protected children with food, stories, instruction, discipline, spiritual guidance, practical training, and ferocious emotional labour that rarely appears fully in plantation accounts. Those accounts loved numbers. They were far less interested in the cost of a mother lying awake to listen for a child's breathing. Fathers too occupy complex space in the night cabin. Some are physically present, some visit from another quarter, some are absent through sale, hiring out, punishment, or death. When present, a father may mend a shoe, hush a child, bank the fire, or simply sit with the worn dignity of a man asked by the world to be provider and protector, while denied the usual means to do either securely. That contradiction could wound deeply. Yet many fathers built authority and tenderness through presence, memory, instruction, and work shared in the margins of the plantation day. One curious detail in recollections of courtship and marriage among enslaved people is how often simple objects gained emotional significance. A ribbon, a carved trinket, a bit of cloth, a shared song, a visit on Saturday night. These were not luxurious tokens, but they carried meaning because meaning does not require wealth, it requires investment. Human feeling can make a ribbon worth more than silver if the ribbon says, "I thought of you while the world tried to make thinking impossible." The room itself cooperates with affection in subtle ways. Someone shifts to create space for a couple to sit nearer the wall. An elder suddenly becomes very interested in the fire, and not at all interested in where two younger people are looking. A child is redirected toward a different lap. These acts are almost invisible, but they matter. Community does not only witness love, it sometimes protects its smallest opportunities. Still, there are limits. Many enslaved people had little control over when and where they could visit spouses or partners. Some unions were encouraged by enslavers for labor reasons. Others were discouraged for the same reason. Sexual exploitation by enslavers and overseers also cast its shadow over every discussion of intimacy in slavery, particularly for women, who faced extraordinary vulnerability. No honest account of love in the quarter can ignore this violence. It shaped the emotional terrain brutally, making trust and safety even more precious where they could be found. And yet the cabin tonight is filled less with spectacle than with durable attachment. A couple exchanges a few quiet words that are ordinary on the surface. Did the child eat enough? Is the blanket too thin? Did you save some meal for morning? Beneath those plain questions lies a whole architecture of partnership. Love here is built from repeated concern. Desire may be present, certainly, but it must share room with survival, childcare, exhaustion, and danger. In that sense, it is perhaps more grown up than the dramatic version celebrated elsewhere. You notice too how affection can be disciplined, not repressed entirely, but contained, so it does not create trouble. A hand rests on another for only a moment. A look is held, then released. Two people speak in low tones, close enough to suggest intimacy, far enough to avoid comment. The quarter teaches emotional timing. Feel deeply. Yes. Display wisely. For older couples, love may appear as habit so practiced it becomes nearly invisible. One person hands the other a cloth without being asked. Another knows exactly where to place bedding because the partner's back hurts on one side. They do not need language for this. Their knowledge of each other sits in the body. In a world obsessed with ownership, such mutual familiarity becomes its own quiet claim. You know this person. You have learned their needs. You have shaped your life around them where possible. That is not nothing. As the room grows dimmer, family groups gather into their sleeping arrangements. A child curls against a parent. Siblings end up in a heap of elbows and warm feet. An older couple lies near enough to share blanket and breath. A younger pair, not yet fully recognized perhaps, manages one last exchange of eyes across the room before settling apart. The dark protects a little. It also separates. Night is generous and stingy at once. You sit in that tension and feel the truth of it. Love in the slave quarter is neither sentimental fantasy nor incidental detail. It is one of the ways enslaved people insisted on personhood within a regime built to deny it. To choose one another, care for one another, desire one another, grieve one another, and remain loyal where possible was to build a human world inside an inhuman system. The fire has nearly gone to coals. Blankets rise and fall with breathing. Outside, the darkness remains full of uncertainty. Inside, affection takes quieter forms now. Warmth shared under rough cloth. A hand found in the dark. A child's sleepy sigh answered by a parent's touch. Love lives here under surveillance, under fatigue, under threat. But it lives. That, in itself, is extraordinary. By this point in the night, most bodies in the cabin have lowered themselves towards sleep, but sleep never fully takes command. Not here. Not in a place where the outside dark can change meaning without warning. The door is shut. The coals are low. Breathing has slowed, yet the whole room remains lightly tethered to whatever may happen beyond the walls. Fear does not always storm in dramatically. More often, it waits outside the door with excellent patience. You feel it first as listening. Someone who seemed asleep opens their eyes at a distant sound. Another person shifts without lifting their head. A child mutters and settles again. The cabin stillness is not the stillness of peace. It is the stillness of alertness disguised as rest. Every sound from outside arrives enlarged. A boot on packed ground. A dog barking twice and then going quiet. The creak of a leather. Wind moving through trees in a way that almost sounds like whispering. Your ears begin trying to sort harmless from dangerous, and they do not always succeed. The fear is not imaginary. In the slaveholding South, nighttime movement was often monitored by patrols, overseers, slave catchers, local militias, or enslavers themselves. Enslaved people found away from their assigned quarters without permission could be questioned. Beaten, arrested, or worse, patrols used horses, lanterns, firearms, dogs, and broad legal authority to control black movement, especially in rural areas. Historians still debate how consistently patrol laws were enforced in every region and how often local custom modified the official rules. But no serious reading of the period removes the threat. The uncertainty itself was part of the punishment. You did not always know when power would appear, only that it could, and so the outside world at night becomes charged. A dog barking in the distance can mean nothing, or it can mean men are out. Hoofbeats can belong to someone passing elsewhere, or not. The quarter learns to interpret sound with a kind of desperate sophistication. One bark is different from a whole pack rising. A drunken stagger is different from a purposeful walk. Men who are laughing carry one danger. Men who are quiet carry another. The cabin hears a sound now. Footsteps. They are not close yet, but close enough to enter the room like a new presence. Breathing changes at once. The air seems to thin. No one speaks. Even the sleepers who do not wake fully seem to feel the shift in the bodies around them. A hand slides toward a child. Another hand rests flat on a blanket as if to steady the whole room. Then the footsteps pass. No knock, no latch, no voice. Only the sound moving away into the yard. That is how fear works here. It flares, grips the chest, then leaves behind a residue even when nothing happens. The body does not recover instantly. It remains ready. Ready takes energy. Energy has already been spent all day. This is one of the cruelties of the system. It steals rest not only by labour but by uncertainty. You understand why people learn to sleep lightly. Deep, careless sleep belongs to those who believe they will be left alone. In the slave quarter, many could not afford that confidence. A parent listens for a child's breathing and for the yard at the same time. An adult half asleep tracks changes in wind, animal sound, and human movement. An elder wakes at the slightest knock. Night rest becomes fractured into segments, each one vulnerable to interruption. Dogs are especially unnerving. Their sound cuts through distance with ugly efficiency. Plantation dogs could be ordinary guard animals, hunting dogs, or animals used more aggressively in pursuit. The bark itself carries social information. A bored yard dog sounds different from a dog set excited by strangers or movement. In some recollections, enslaved people described learning individual dogs by voice, which ones chased, which could be distracted, which belonged to which white household. That kind of knowledge sounds almost absurdly detailed until you realize it could shape survival. A curious detail from some 19th century accounts is how people sometimes read the behavior of animals as early warning. Horses stamping unusually late, dogs restless before footsteps appeared, chickens disturbed at odd hours. Whether every such memory was accurate is another question. Fear sharpens perception, and memory can give shape to anxiety after the fact. Still, in a world where formal warning systems served the powerful, informal ones mattered. The door remains shut, but not reassuringly shut. It is a barrier, yes, but a fragile one. The wood is thin. The latch is simple. A determined person from outside can enter. Everyone in the cabin knows this. That knowledge changes the very meaning of the door. It is not safety exactly. It is a pause, a threshold, a small assertion of inside against outside, useful, necessary, not sufficient. Then there is the fear of punishment already underway. Someone in the quarter may be returning late. Someone may have been caught visiting a spouse on another plantation. Someone may have spoken too boldly during the day. Someone may be accused of stealing food, keeping back work, resisting, meeting secretly, or simply existing while another person wanted to feel powerful. Punishment under slavery did not require justice in any recognizable sense. It required only hierarchy and mood. A noise from farther off carries across the night, not words at first, then voices. One voice raised, then lowered, another sharper. The cabin stiffens. Nobody rushes outside. That would be foolish. Instead, people listen from within the dark, trying to determine distance and direction. Is it near the road? Near the stable? Near another cabin? The inability to see clearly makes the imagination cruel. It supplies scenes faster than evidence can correct them. You feel the pressure of not knowing. That may be the most exhausting element of all. If danger were constant and visible, perhaps the body would grow numb. But danger in the quarter is intermittent, arbitrary, and opaque. It arrives by rumour, sound, missing people, changed expressions, and morning evidence. The night teaches vigilance precisely because the full picture is often unavailable. The fear outside the door is not limited to patrols and punishers. There is also the fear of sale, which may not occur at night but can haunt the night terribly. A person who heard worrying talk that day may lie awake listening to every movement as though tomorrow's separation could already be approaching on horseback. A mother may gather children nearer and sleep because she cannot control what morning might bring. An older man may stare at the roof rather than close his eyes because memory has taught him how abruptly a life can split. Scholars have written about the profound psychological strain created by the instability of enslaved family life, and rightly so. Yet academic language can sound pale beside the practical fact of one person lying in a smoky room trying to count the breathing of everyone they love. Fear here is not abstract. It is counted in bodies still present. Outside, wind brushes the side of the cabin. The sound resembles fingers for a moment and then does not. Your body reacts anyway. This is the trouble with nerves. They are rarely interested in waiting for confirmation. An adult near the wall rises quietly and checks the door. The movement is careful, the feet memorizing the silent path between sleepers, a glance through a gap, a pause. Then the person settles back down. Nothing visible. That should calm the room. It helps only a little. Once fear is awake, it prefers to linger. There are darker dangers too, though people rarely name them fully at this hour. Sexual violence, sudden intrusion, drunken cruelty, false accusation, theft born of desperation, conflicts between enslaved people sharpened by unbearable conditions, all could exist at the edges of plantation night. No community under such pressure remains free of strain. To admit that does not diminish solidarity. It honours the complexity of real life under coercion. At the same time, the quarter could also protect its own through warning, shared knowledge, and mutual attention. A knock in a certain pattern. News passed quickly, an elder advising caution, a neighbour listening through the wall. Thin cabins made privacy scarce, but they also made some dangers harder to hide. Community could not prevent everything. It could, however, keep people from facing every fear alone. You hear another sound. Not footsteps this time, hoofbeats, slow then stopping. A horse shifts somewhere beyond the nearest cabins. Leather creaks. A man coughs. There is a murmur too faint to make out. Perhaps it is nothing directed at this cabin. Perhaps someone is merely passing through. Yet the effect is immediate. The whole room seems to hold its breath. Fear has entered not by the door but by imagination, which can move through walls much more efficiently. Minutes stretch. No one counts them aloud. The coals settle. A child turns over and presses closer to an adult body. Somewhere another cabin door opens briefly and closes again. The horse moves off at last. Hoofbeats fade. The yard returns to insects and wind. Only then does the room begin, very slowly, to loosen. A long breath escapes someone near the hearth. An elder mutters what may be a prayer or may simply be tired annoyance directed at the universe. Blankets are readjusted. A child is soothed without fully waking. Rest tries to resume. though it does not return unchanged. That is the true burden of the night fear in the slave quarter. It does not always produce dramatic scenes. Often it produces interruption, caution, shallow sleep, and minds that must remain partly awake in order to survive. The consequences gather quietly. A tired body works tomorrow. A frightened child wakes earlier. A mother's nerves sit closer to the surface. An elder's chest feels tighter. Fear becomes another labour added to the day's account. And yet, even here, there is resistance in the form of endurance. The cabin keeps its people inside. Bodies gather closer. Hands find children in the dark. Eyes close again, even if reluctantly. The night has not become safe, but the room has not surrendered either. Outside the door remains a world of patrols, dogs, hoofbeats, and men who believe power belongs to them naturally. Inside the door, people continue the quieter work of surviving them one uneasy hour at a time. Toward the deepest part of the night, the cabin enters a strange, suspended state. Almost everyone is lying down now. The fire is nearly spent. The room has stopped arranging itself and simply exists. A low shape full of breathing, warmth, smoke, and uncertainty. Outside, the darkness feels broader than before, less like evening and more like a great space where time itself has thinned. This is the hour when sleep comes closest, yet never fully owns the night. You feel it in the slowness. Breaths lengthen. Bodies settle more heavily into straw, boards, cloth, and one another. The room no longer speaks in words. Instead, it speaks through tiny movements. A blanket drawn higher, a shoulder turned, a hand resting over a child's chest for one moment to confirm that all is well. The soundscape is narrow now. A soft snore from one corner, a sleeping sigh, coals shifting under ash, wind touching the outside wall. The whole cabin seems to float inside these sounds. This late hour is often imagined as rest, and in one sense it is. The body finally claims what it can. Muscles unclench, burning feet cool, hands open after gripping tools and burdens all day. A back that has been bent to labour lies flat, if only briefly. Even an exhausted mind loosens its grip on calculation. Yet rest in the slave quarter is never simple surrender. It remains watchful, conditional, and brief. Morning is already approaching, though not yet visible. That knowledge lives in the room, even without speech. A body shaped by forced routine begins anticipating dawn before dawn appears. Many enslaved people rose before sunrise, often at the sound of a horn, bell, driver's call, or the movement of others preparing the morning fire. Night, therefore, has a fixed ceiling. It cannot stretch to meet need. It ends when labour demands it end. Historians have written about the punishing rhythm of time under slavery, the way even domestic hours were compressed by long work days and external control. You can feel that compression now. Sleep is precious partly because it is rationed. Somewhere inside the cabin, a person is still awake. Maybe it is a mother whose thoughts refuse to settle. Maybe an elder whose joints ache too sharply for sleep. Maybe a man whose mind keeps circling some worry from the day. Wakefulness in such an hour has its own texture. The room is too quiet for distraction. Every concern grows larger in the dark. A child's cough seems more ominous. A rumour heard at sunset gains detail it did not previously possess. Absence becomes unbearable if you let the mind rest on it too long. And yet this hour also invites inwardness. Without the demands of conversation, labour, tending, and listening for immediate interruptions, a person may drift into memory or hope. Not grand public hope, not a speech fit for a platform, but the small private hope that tomorrow a child's fever will ease, that a spouse may visit, that a garden row will yield something useful, that punishment will pass you by, that a body will hold out one more season, that a scattered family member is somehow still alive under the same stars. Hope under slavery often shrank to very modest dimensions. That did not make it weak. It made it exact. You can imagine someone staring up into the dark roofline, following where moonlight slips through a crack, thinking of people beyond the cabin. Enslaved communities were often stretched across distances by sale, hiring out, inheritance, and the internal trade. Kin networks could span nearby plantations or states far apart. Letters were rare and difficult. Reliable news was not guaranteed. Memory had to bridge what law and commerce broke apart. In the silent part of night, those missing people may feel especially near. A scholarly uncertainty lingers over how often enslaved people in 1840 understood the full geographic scale of the domestic slave trade. Some clearly knew a great deal through rumour, witnessed sales, and personal loss. Others likely held partial knowledge shaped by local experience. Historians debate the reach of this awareness because evidence comes unevenly through narratives, plantation papers, and later testimony. But nobody needed a map to understand what separation meant. The body understood that at once. The cabin itself participates in this final stretch of night. Its smoke has thinned into a fainter scent. Clay and wood cool slowly. The air near the floor is colder now, while the air around clustered bodies remains slightly warmer. Every object seems to have settled into its overnight identity. The stool by the hearth is no longer furniture. It is silhouette. The iron pot is dark and still. The hanging cloth does not divide space anymore. It simply hangs in shadow. Night strips things to outline. A child mutters in sleep. An adult's hand answers instinctively, smoothing hair or blanket without fully waking. That hand may belong to a person who's already worked beyond human fairness, but care continues even in half-consciousness. There is something profoundly moving about that. Under conditions designed to exploit every waking hour, tenderness still leaks into the unconscious habits of the night. Outside, the world is not entirely still. Owls call in some regions. Frogs keep their patient rhythm. A far-off branch snaps. Perhaps a mule shifts in a lot. Perhaps another cabin stirs. The quarter as a whole sleeps in fragments. Many small circles of breathing separated by yards of darkness and tied together by shared fatigue. This is also the hour when dreams matter. Dreaming under slavery could be comfort, terror, memory, prophecy, nonsense, or all of these at once. Some people treated dreams with seriousness, especially if they involved absent kin, death, warning, or spiritual signs. Others dismissed them, though even dismissal could carry unease. In communities shaped by both Christian belief and older cosmologies, dreams sometimes occupied an uncertain but meaningful space. A peculiar detail from recollections of 19th century black life is how often dreams were discussed not as private oddities, but as events worth interpreting. In a world where control was limited, the mind's night theatre could feel significant. Perhaps one sleeper dreams of running and cannot move. Another dreams of a full table. Another hears a mother's voice long gone. Another sees open water, or a road, or a place with no overseer in sight. The cabin cannot know these dreams, yet they pass through the room like silent weather. Sleep is communal in arrangement, private in content. Then gradually the first change begins. Not light yet, not exactly. More a thinning of the dark. The air shifts before the eye confirms anything. Roosters may not yet call, but some body somewhere senses morning nearing. An elder wakes a little and then lies still, listening. The person who kept half watch all night surrenders at last to a brief, shallow sleep just when the useful part of rest is nearly over. This is one of history's cruel jokes. The last minutes before dawn can be the sweetest, and also the least available. You realize how quickly the room must soon transform. Bedding will be folded or shaken. Coals will be coaxed back to life. Water fetched if any remains to fetch. Children roused or carried. Clothes pulled on. Bodies reassembled into workers, caregivers, field hands, servants, drivers, cooks, nurses, teamsters, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. Night identities and daytime identities are not truly separate, but dawn forces a visible shift between them. The cabin that held whispers, songs, warmth, and fear must prepare once more for extraction. And still, there is a final quiet dignity in this hour just before morning claims the room. No overseer stands here now. No ledger records this moment. No plantation account book notes the blanket tucked over a child at midnight. The prayer murmured into smoke. The hand checking the latch. The song hummed under breath. the glance between spouses, the old woman's advice, the little comfort of shared heat. Yet these are the things that made survival possible. Not merely endurance as abstract heroism, but endurance as nightly practice, domestic, repetitive, skilled, unrecorded. Human life persisted in all these details. That is what you carry from this dark room in 1840. Not a single dramatic scene, but a chain of ordinary acts under extraordinary pressure. People ate, mended, soothed, whispered, listened, remembered, feared, loved, and slept as best they could. They shaped a world inside the quarter, constrained and vulnerable, yes, yet rich with intention. The night did not free them, but neither did it erase them. Now the first true hint of dawn presses faintly at the edges of the cabin. It is not beautiful in a sentimental sense. It is simply inevitable. Someone stirs more fully. A child resists waking even in sleep. The coals wait for breath. The day is coming with all its demands already loaded upon it. Yet for one final breath, the room still belongs to night, to those low hours when black Americans in slavery kept one another alive through care too ordinary for monuments and too powerful to forget. The darkness begins to lift, and with it the cabin prepares once again. Let the room soften now in your mind. Let the smoke fade into the rafters and the rough walls blur into shadow. The voices are quiet. The footsteps outside have gone still. The fire is only a red memory under ash. You can feel the warmth of shared blankets, the closeness of sleeping bodies, the hush of a world paused between one hardship and the next. Nothing here is grand, and yet everything matters. A hand resting over a child, a folded cloth beneath an elder's head, a breath drawn slowly in the dark, a tiny act of care repeated so often it becomes the shape of survival itself. As sleep settles more deeply over the quarter, the night loosens its grip. The cabin cools. The air grows pale at the edges. Worry drifts a little farther off, not gone, just quieter for now. You're left with the gentler truths. The murmur of song almost remembered, the smell of ash and wood, the steady rhythm of people enduring together. Let those details grow soft and distant. Let the hard outlines disappear. Let the dark become calm, and the calm become rest. The night has held its fears, but it has also held tenderness, skill, and the quiet courage of ordinary people caring for one another in impossible circumstances. Now, as the first light waits beyond the door, you can let the cabin fade into stillness.